he's part of the reason why this is the case.
Have you been allowed into debates or forums?
Yes, yeah. We've been very, very fortunate that there have been, I want to say, about 7 or 8 forums in the last couple of months before the primaries, and I believe there's another 7 or 8 that we've so far scheduled for the next month. And we have been there, and what's interesting is that in every forum that I've been to, and every forum that I know of coming up, it's been myself, the Democratic challenger, Bert Saunders, and Connie Mack hasn't been anywhere to be seen at any of the forums.
None of them so far?
Not one single forum. The closest he came...
Is he scheduled to be at the future?
So far, every forum that I've gotten feedback from has said that the 3 of us have agreed, but they haven't heard from Connie Mack.
Could you please size up Mr. Saunders?
Mr. Saunders is I actually have to admit I have a lot of respect for Bert Saunders for choosing to run as an independent. However, I wish he was a little more independent about being an independent. He has basically gone on record as saying that he is a Republican in everything but name only. And I think a big part of a big part of the problem that we have is with the two-party system. And my concern is that I think what we really need in Congress is we need a truly independent representative. We need somebody that can stand aside from the partisan politics. Senator Saunders has a distinguished career in politics, in politics here in the state, and that's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, you can say he's got the experience. On the other hand, is he part and parcel of the system as we know it? I also I have nothing against him at all personally. Like I said, I do respect him, but on the issues, I think we are 180 degrees apart on many of the issues.
Just give us one example.
One example would be, and this came up in a forum recently, when Russia invaded Georgia after Georgia attacked South Ossetia and the Russian peacekeepers. I went up there, and my response to the question was, what is the United States doing taking sides in the Balkans? This is an area where we need to have much clearer foreign policy, where we need to be fair brokers of democracy and human rights and international law, not taking sides in regional conflicts, which is exactly what we're doing. And that was my position, and when it came up for his time to give the answer, it was a very sort of America has nothing to apologize for, sort of pro-America rhetoric. And I think I haven't heard a lot from him on the foreign policy side, but he sounds like he's very much in line with the Bush doctrine. And I love throwing that around with happened with Sarah Palin last week. So.
If we could go to something closer to home, can you give us your views on the offshore oil drilling debate?
I think offshore oil drilling is a mistake. Basically, it's a gimme to the oil companies, and I'll give you several reasons why. First of all, they're already sitting on, in the Gulf of Mexico alone, they're sitting on 8 billion barrels of potential oil that they haven't drilled. What we're talking about is another 4 billion additional barrels that they want to get the rights to. Secondly, there's the environmental issue, which everybody talks about the safety of the oil rigs and the potential for a spill, which is certainly an important threat. But also, in the life of a typical offshore oil rig, they put out about, according to Scientific American, they put out about 900,000 tons of waste. That includes a lot of metal. And when you have that close to the continental shelf, not only is that going to be washing up on our beaches, but more importantly for the long term, how is that going to affect the ecology of the area? Thirdly, we have to ask ourselves where that oil is actually going. Aside from the fact that we're talking about a country that uses over 20 million barrels a day, if you're talking about 4 billion barrels, that's not going to last too long. But if an international oil company, if a multinational corporation comes and drills off our coast, there's no guarantee that that oil is going to go directly to the United States. That oil is going to go out into the open market. And so this oil that we're risking our environment for, that we're doing, that we're potentially causing all these problems for, is just as likely to get sold to India or to Russia or to China as any other oil. So I think basically it's a scam being perpetuated by the oil companies. They want to lock up as much of this as they can. What we need to do is we need to get away from our addiction to oil. We need to start looking at alternative energy sources. And the piddling amount of oil that's there for us to drill is nothing compared to what we could do with the amount of oil that we could save with conservation techniques, or more importantly, by developing wind, solar, geothermal. These are much better alternatives than drilling from oil.
Have you ever run for public office before?
No, I haven't. I considered a run doing exactly this in 2002, but the technology wasn't quite there yet, and also it just wasn't the right environment politically at the time.
You mentioned ensuring a fair system of taxation. What does that look like?
Well, one of the things that's that I've been giving a lot of thought to, and hopefully we want to present this in the last couple of days of what we see with what's going on in the market now, in the housing market, and particularly how that's finally having a very noticeable effect on the stock market. I think first and foremost when we're talking about tax, we have to go back to a fundamental issue of philosophy. And it seems almost absurd that you have to point this out, but my basic philosophy on government and the private sector is this, is that, when you're talking about any system of governing, you have to recognize that what it's about is it's about balancing individual rights and needs versus the rights and needs of the society as a whole. And the best institutions to guarantee individual rights, I think by far, are always going to be the private sector. Business, charities, that sort of thing. And the best institution for guaranteeing the common good is government. And I say it's absurd to point this out, but really this seems to be lost in a lot of ideologies that we see around here. The idea that the government actually has a real, not only potential for good, but an absolutely essential function in human society, and that is to ensure the common good. Now, you asked me about taxation. Where this comes down to is basically, when I made the comment about Milton Friedman, there's this attitude that I think a lot of politicians are operating under right now, even if it's going unspoken, is that government is bad, get rid of government, everybody should have the maximum amount of opportunity. All of these things I agree with, but when we're talking about taxation, what you have to recognize is that the reality is that the market does not take care of the common good. The market takes care of the individual players in the marketplace. And wealth and power polarize in an unregulated market. And so when we're talking about taxation, I am completely open to the option of having a different type of tax other than an income tax. I've looked at some ideas like the fair tax and that sort of thing. But the essential thing that has to happen is we have to have a progressive system of taxation. There has to be a system that recognizes that those who make more have a responsibility to pay more back into the system.
A bigger percentage or just more?
A bigger percentage. Because if you're talking about a flat tax, obviously if someone who's making $10 million a year is going to pay more than someone who's making $30,000 a year. But the question is would a flat rate actually represent represent a real, not, I don't want to say sacrifice, but would it represent a realistic contribution in terms of the individual power that person has? Another issue is I think it's absolutely essential that we repeal the Bush tax cuts. Taxes like the capital gains system, or the capital gains tax, and the inheritance tax. The amount of people that these actually affect is so incredibly minute compared to the general population, and yet the amount of influence that these people have because of their income is magnified 1,000-fold. And so we need to make sure that we have a fair system that represents that. And going back to the idea of the fair tax, one of the things that I do like about the fair tax is that it is essentially a progressive taxation system because of the rebate system. I'm not sure that it's going to work, I think it may destroy the U.S. economy if we try to implement it, but it's an interesting idea, and I think that it's something that I'm willing to look at. But in the meantime, if we're going to talk about radically overhauling the tax system, we just have to make sure that it's going to be done in a progressive manner, and that before we get to that point, that we have a system, or we have that we take advantage of the system that we have as best as possible.
One question I'd like to ask candidates, and especially you, because you've obviously given a lot of things a lot of thought, okay? And you've traveled the world. What have you learned that you didn't know before? What have you learned since the campaign started?
There's so many things. A lot of what I've learned, we sort of started with the premise that there's a problem with money in politics. And a lot of what I've learned in this process is sort of experiential knowledge, where it's, in theory, I understood a lot of these problems.
You thought that this was going to happen.
Yeah, but now actually being a part of the system, I understand from a first-person point of view so much better now where the problems are and some of the things that we can do to fix it. I also have to admit that I have gained much greater respect for community, city, and county level politicians than I had going into this.
Really?
And the reason for that is because I see how much they interact with the community on a daily basis. Not all of them, of course, but by and large, there's a lot of good people here in the counties, in this area, and in the cities who do interact with the community quite a bit. And I also see how blurry the distinction gets between Republican and Democrat when you get away from the large national hot button issues and you're actually talking about the day-to-day finances of running a county or running a city. I was at a League of Women's Voters meeting a few months back, and Ray Judah spoke. And Ray Judah got up there and he was talking about the need to make sure that the county had sufficient revenue, and he was talking about taxes. And I was thinking, God, he sounds like a Democrat. And just as I was thinking of that in my mind, Ray Judah said, I'm a Republican, but you probably wouldn't know that from hearing me. You'd think I'd sound like a Democrat. But I think that's true. When you get away from the rhetoric, the campaign rhetoric, what you see on the local level, there's a much better understanding because they deal with the reality of what their decisions are every day on a daily basis, whereas in Washington, D.C., there's a real disconnect. And nobody exemplifies that better than our current Congressman, Representative Mack. I mean, the consistent complaint I hear about the guy is that he's never in the district.
Do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
As someone who's traveled the Middle East, I'd be really interested in your take on the war on terror.
The war on terror, it's almost a cliche to say it, but first and foremost, that's a misnomer. That you can't fight a war on an abstract. Terrorism is a real problem. There's no denying it. Terrorism is something that threatens the security of American citizens and American institutions or American installations. But terrorism by itself is not a existential threat to the United States. What is a threat to the United States is if we pursue this issue instead of as a criminal intelligence matter, if we pursue it as a political matter, if we pursue it as it's so often framed in this country as a Christianity versus Islamic debate, if we allow that to pollute our national politics, what we end up with is a situation where we can make some very real strategic blunders like we did in Iraq, like we have the potential to do with Afghanistan and Pakistan if we're not careful how we deal with that. And of course, the strategic blunder of all blunders would be either attacking Iran or allowing an attack on Iran. If we do that, this presents a real threat to America as we know it, to American power as we know it, and I think to the long-term stability of this country. And so when we talk about the war on terror, yes, I am a Muslim, and I can tell you from personal experience that the majority of Muslims, both here in America and abroad, do not subscribe to the Al-Qaeda ideology, but there are some that do. The percentage isn't this ridiculous 5%, I think 5% is what they're saying, I've seen in some circles. But there are probably hundreds of thousands of Muslims worldwide who do take some support in this, some support the Al Qaeda ideology. But again, this problem that we have is the United States needs to stand by the courage of its convictions. The United States, if we're going to talk about promoting freedom and democracy and human rights, then we have to have a consistent standard for these issues that respects international law. And what I hear over and over again from Muslims here in the US and overseas is the reason they hate our policy is because of the hypocrisy. Because we look at countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which is has a repressive, autocratic government in Egypt and an autocratic theocracy in Saudi Arabia, and we say these are our allies. And then we look at Syria, who in many ways mirrors a lot of what we see in Egypt, and Iran, that mirrors a lot of the fundamentalism that we see in Saudi Arabia. And we have decided, for what seem to people in the Middle East, very arbitrary reasons, that these are our enemies. The human rights violations are the same. The fact that these are anti-democratic governments in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt or Pakistan, and yet we choose to ally ourselves with the dictators that seem to support America's short-term policy goals and go against those dictators that don't. That seems to be, in the mind of people in the Middle East, it seems to be that the only standard is not what's just, not what's fair, not the issue of human rights, but who supports our agenda at any given time. And this is what we have to change. America has to have a consistent foreign policy. If we're going to say we respect democracy, then we respect it in all of its forms. If we say that we are going to stand for human rights, then we stand for human rights everywhere. And this is what has to change.
You should run for Secretary of State.
If it was an elected position, I'd be there.
Listen, thank you for your time. That's the last word.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anybody told you look like Mike Myers?
Oh, really? That's I haven't gotten that one. I just got Michael J. Fox yesterday. Someone told me that.
Okay.
Just behind.
You know, one thing I did want to kind of to broach with you all. This isn't necessarily part of the candidate interviews. One of the things we're trying to make happen is a candidate debate with all four candidates outside the forums that we have going now. And I was talking to the Lee County League of Women's Voters, and in the end they just kind of decided they were overwhelmed and couldn't sponsor the debate. So now we're in the process, I believe, of talking with the Collier League. But
Yes, they always do one. Yes.
yeah, I know they
They're
do a
very good
candidate
at that.
forum.
Yes.
But we were hoping to actually get a debate, because the problem that we have is this Connie Max he's got $1.5 million, which is by a factor of 10 better than what any of us other challengers have, and he just seems to have no interest in actually getting involved in the election process this year.
Okay.
So we were hoping to really find a way to, first of all, find the proper forum, a real actual debate forum. I've spoken with Bert Saunders, I've spoken with Robert Neal, they both agreed to this. We just need to get Connie Mack involved, and then finding a third-party sponsor to get this debate happening.
Say the League of Women Voters, though, is doing one, right?
Well, they're doing candidate forums. The Lee County League is doing a candidate forum, which is basically all the candidates doing the 3 minutes.
Oh, so that
1 minute thing.
So that wouldn't be a debate.
No, it's not an actual debate, and I haven't gotten an invite yet, so I'm not sure what the Collier County League is doing. I have one of the guys that works with me. He's talking with them now. I know it's late in the process.
Yep.
This is one of those things you ask what I've learned. I've learned I would have got started on this a lot sooner if I had known better.
Let me talk to our editor, okay?
Okay. But this is something that I think really needs to happen. When was the last time this district saw a congressional debate?
I can think of a couple not too many years ago, but your point is well made.
Before I arrived.
I think it was before Porter Goss, wasn't it?
Thank you for
Nice to
having
meet you.
me. Good to see upon you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, this way. All right. Yeah, I think that went well. It's hard to tell. My brain is kind of in overdrive right now, like I said, from lack of food and lack of sleep. But they seem receptive. Hopefully we'll see something positive from that. pick up on the debate suggestion and see if we can get something rolling in that direction. I'm also hoping that they will take what I've said, and I'm sure the other challengers will say something similar about Representative Mack never being around, never being at the forums, and maybe challenge him on that issue as well in the paper itself. But all in all, I think that went well. I would have liked to ask them some questions about their role, but with the half-hour time at 30-minute format, it's kind of difficult. I think this is a good case of what we're going to do is once the election process is over, I would love to come back and talk to Jeff Lytle and some of the other editors here and do an interview with them about the process as a whole when we're actually able to look at it from a third-party perspective. Hopefully that'll be from the perspective of me as a candidate, or excuse me, me as a congressman, but if not, me as a documentarian around will always be the position that I'll be in.